it. And it's great to be back. I didn't preach last weekend at all. So it feels like ages. And we're going to continue our wholehearted series, which has sort of been running all year. And we've been talking about just living life with all our hearts. And I think this morning might have been number 9 or number 10 on emotional intelligence. And if you don't mind, we're going to go there again tonight. So who's been enjoying emotional intelligence and just how to really understand ourselves? I guess this is an encouragement to understand ourselves and what we're feeling, and to manage that, with our understanding and our ability to identify what's going on the inside of us, our ability to then manage that both in ourselves and in our relationships. And that's really what emotional intelligence has been about as we've been looking at it. Your awareness and understanding both of your own emotions and the emotions of people around you, and then being able to use that information to get a good result. How's that sound? That's a good thing to know. And more recently in the morning services, if you haven't listened to what we've been doing in the mornings, the last couple of weeks I think have been pretty good, if I must say so myself. 2 weeks ago I spoke about the temptations of Jesus Christ, and we looked at how Jesus handled himself, because emotions are a major part of temptation. If you haven't noticed, pretty well everything you can be tempted by, there's an emotional trigger in it. And so if you can learn to master your emotions, you can learn to deal with some of the big decisions of life and make sure you don't make bad ones at crucial times. That sounds like good news. And this morning we looked at the part that emotions play when we're under pressure. And if you weren't here for that, then I encourage you to listen to the podcast. Get onto the website and listen to the podcast on that, because who knows, you need to be able to handle your emotions in pressurized situations. The problem is, when we get into a pressurized situation, we really need to be thinking clearly. But the problem is, under pressure, our emotions kick in and it's hard to think clearly and rationally. So listen to this morning. It could help you with a way forward. And tonight, I'm getting on to some stuff about how to grow your emotional intelligence, or your emotional quotient, your capacity to understand and manage your emotions. How do you grow it, baby? Hey, come on, that's what we really want to know. It's one thing just to identify it, but who wants to actually grow in this so that you get stronger in it? And so this is the gold tonight. This is the secret sauce tonight when it comes to emotional intelligence. And as we've been saying all along, defining our emotions really by our personal awareness and our personal management, and our social awareness and our social management. Well, tonight we're really going to be talking about personal awareness. And this is like where it all really starts. Galatians chapter 6, verse 3, the Apostle Paul says, if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. In other words, if you can be very unaware of who you actually are. But emotional intelligence begins by really getting a bit of self-perspective and understanding not only who you are, but what you're feeling and where you're at in the moment. So the question is, how can you really know yourself, and particularly emotionally, what's happening on the inside of you? Here's some thoughts on how you can get to know yourself better. You ready? You ready? First one I mentioned this morning already. It was in the message, but I want to go a bit deeper tonight. And that is, lean into the pain. Lean into your pain. It's a major exercise in self-awareness. Don't avoid the difficult questions about yourself. Sometimes there's a perfectly good reason why we aren't as self-aware as we could be. And that is, we don't actually like what we see. Sometimes we actually don't want to discover things about ourselves. But the fact is, if you want to grow in self-awareness and therefore your emotional intelligence, then you have got to be able to accept the truth about yourself even regarding your shortcomings. Being able to look at yourself honestly is foundational to self-awareness. And the fact is, and I said this morning, but as a way of pointing this out, we all know people. We all have someone in our lives who just seems to be not self-aware. They say things and you can say to yourself, my goodness, did they think about that before they said it? Or have they even thought about it since they said it? Do they realize the bomb they just dropped on people around them? Or maybe it's in actions where they do something and it's like, really? Do you stop and think about the impact you're having? Come on, who knows someone like that? Yeah. Who's sitting next? No, don't go there. Don't go there. But we all know that. We've all observed that. And I guess tonight I'm saying, hey, don't be that person. We can say to ourselves, why would someone be like that? Why would they be so? Generally, the reason is because they're refusing to do exactly what I'm talking about. They are so busy trying to outrun their pain that they're not game to look in the rearview mirror and even take stock of some of the pain that they're causing. But if we stop and we're prepared to ask ourselves the tough questions, it's amazing what you can learn about yourself. And when you can learn that about yourself, there is some small chance you might actually be able to change that behavior. It's never comfortable to face perceived character flaws or inabilities or insecurities or weaknesses, but ignoring them does not necessarily help you. Understanding them so that you can plot a way forward is helpful. Here's maybe an example of the kind of conversation we sometimes have with ourselves. Well, I'm not going to respond well to that because that always makes me feel really inadequate. Well, the question you've got to ask of that is, well, are you? Are you inadequate? Like, really? There's a big difference between being inadequate and just feeling inadequate. Do you realize that? And I see this often played out. I see this played out most often around grief. When there's been a loss, someone has lost something or someone, and we know someone's hurting. And we can ask ourselves the question, well, I would feel uncomfortable around that. I'm not sure that I would know what to say. Come on, who's ever said that to themselves when someone close to them, that they've lost something and you're like, man, I don't know what to say. It is easier to avoid the pain. I don't know what to say. Do you want to know something? You just feel inadequate. The fact is, in a grief situation, generally, there is nothing you can say. However, your company, your empathy, just by turning up, would be greatly appreciated. And so we miss the moment to actually grow and be something to someone in their point of need, simply because emotionally we avoid the pain rather than move toward it. You understand what I mean? And learn something about ourselves. Just listen to this passage. I'm going to read a bit of scripture tonight, if that's all right. I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to do it quickly. But I've never seen this passage in this context before. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. It's a pretty well-known passage by the Apostle Paul. But he says this, and of course he's a great preacher, great teacher. He writes most of the New Testament. And he says this, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of revelation." In other words, he's saying, because God is using me to speak so clearly and so much, there's a chance that pride could get in the way with me. But he says, lest I should go that way, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure, lest people think too much of me. And then he says, concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. Paul is hurting over this thing. There's something in my life that I am not comfortable with. I am not happy with. I'm literally pleading with God to remove it. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. And then he sort of has a backflip. And then he says, therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Now, theologians, there's all sorts of thoughts on what this might be. Paul says to the Philippians that they would have given him their own eyes if they could have. So, when he met Jesus, he was actually struck with like a spiritual blindness. And so some theologians say that, that the effects of that, there was an ongoing effect in his life. And in older age, his eyes began to get very weak. And he signed some of his own letters aren't written by his own hand. They're written by people who are with him on the journey. So some say it might have been that, but we don't really know what this is. But the principle remains for everything. Something that Paul didn't want to face and wanted God to take away. God actually showed him that if you actually face and accept your weakness, my power can actually come upon it. In verse 10, he actually goes as far as saying, therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities. But not only that, in reproaches, in needs, in persecution, even in distress for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And Paul recognized that actually facing up to, leaning into the pain, accepting his weaknesses allowed God a chance to work in them. So the question becomes, what are you running away from within yourself that you need to turn and face? Because when you're able to turn and face some of the things you're not so happy with, when you're able to actually lean into the pain of those things, it gives God a chance to work in them. Come on, tonight as I'm talking to you, come on, let's be real. We're in church here tonight. Let's be real. If you turn and face some of the things you've been running from, God could actually just do a work in you through those things. Learn to face the things you find uncomfortable about yourself, and you'll start finding ways to bring change to it. Cool? You okay? Here's the next thought. Know who, so we're talking about developing emotional intelligence by developing self-awareness. Foundational to emotional intelligence. Here's the second thought. Know who and what pushes your buttons. Know who and what pushes your buttons. Anyone here got any buttons to be pushed tonight? Jesus is a great example of this. Jesus had like this ongoing feud with the Pharisees and the religious leaders of his day. As a matter of fact, Jesus didn't have it with them, they had it with him. There's a difference, there's a big difference. Just because you're at odds with someone doesn't mean you need to be the antagonist. And Jesus was always in conflict with these guys, but it was these guys lining up to create the conflict. In Matthew chapter 22, there's a great story. Again, I'm going to read it. I'll read it quickly. And it'll be a familiar passage for many of us, but it's where these guys were trying to snare Jesus with tricky questions. And they were always trying to do that. And they tried to get him on a technicality with allegiance to whether our primary allegiance should be to God or whether it should be to the government. And they said, tell us therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the tax money. So they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, whose image and inscription is this? And they said, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now, what they were trying to do was actually put him in a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation. Who's ever been there? Doesn't matter which way I jump, someone's going to be upset with me. And so they're hoping to get him to say, well, to Caesar, and then all the religious people would rightfully have cause. If he said, no, don't pay tax to Caesar, then of course they could accuse him of being subversive to the government, and the Romans would have been after him. And so that's where they're trying to put him. And it must have been so frustrating for him because they were majoring on minors, which is what religion always does. It majors on minors. But Jesus was so together under pressure, under scrutiny. I mean, how tempting would it have been for him to lash out? But he didn't. He gave them an incredibly clever answer. And it wasn't that he was afraid to confront them. There are plenty of situations where Jesus challenges them openly about a pretense of religion while they're dishonoring God. Here's the point I'm trying to make. Exercising emotional intelligence means that you can pick your battles. Jesus could have taken them on and had a massive clash over just about everything they ever said. And sometimes he clashed dramatically with them, and other times he didn't. Because he picked these battles, because he knew what pushed his buttons and what didn't. Have you ever heard the thought or the concept, and every parent here will know this when it comes to parenting children, particularly teenagers, so many of you here tonight, it's great to see you. But you can win the battle and lose the war. You've got to pick the battles that you want to win. And that's a sign of high emotional intelligence when you don't just let everything punch your clock. Even the stuff that does get up your nose. But you understand, I might win this battle, but I'll lose the war, I'll lose ground. There's some things I'm going to stand on, and there's some things I'm going to let go through to the keeper. So how are you at working out what pushes your buttons? Do you know what pushes your buttons, the situations that sometimes you put yourself in where you're never going to get a good result? How good are you working out who and what pushes your buttons and avoiding being at the mercy of your own emotional outbursts? Because that's the result. If you can work that out, you can avoid being trapped by your own emotional responses. And you can become proactive. Someone who begins to think this way and exercise their emotional intelligence knows when they're heading into a difficult situation and actually thinks about the response they're going to make before the moment. Who's worked out how hard it is to actually not respond badly when you're in the moment if something's pushing your buttons? But emotional intelligence has already read it, has seen it coming, and has already thought of the response before the moment, in the cool of the moment, making the decision. This is how I'm going to react, and this will be my response, no matter what button they push. Come on, how are you at leaning into that and working out? Come on, can you see any buttons? As I've been speaking, do you know what pushes your buttons? As I've been speaking, do you know who pushes your buttons? How are you at managing that? Because if you can get good at that, you will grow your self-awareness massively. Before I get in this situation, what's going to push my buttons here? Because I don't want to fall in any of those traps. Okay, here's another thought. You ready for one more? And then we're finished. We're out of here. We're off to Walton Stores. Fed on the inside, and then we feed the outside. Keep yourself under your own oversight. I know that's a bit of a funny term. Keep yourself under your own oversight. Keep yourself under your own oversight. In other words, get a perspective of looking down over your life, almost like develop a third-person perspective of your own life. A great example, I guess, or thinking, I guess, is like an eagle. An eagle soars above everything to keep the big picture. We do well to learn from the eagle because sometimes we find ourselves in difficult situations because we've actually lost a bigger perspective on what's happening in our lives. You know, an eagle's vision can reach 4 to 5 times further than a person with perfect vision. You got 20/20 vision, an eagle's got between 24 and 25 vision. What you can see clearly at 6 meters, an eagle can see the same crystal clearness 30.5 meters away. An eagle can spot a rabbit 3.2 kilometers away when it's soaring above the earth. That's pretty amazing. Interestingly, the most common word in the New Testament for leadership, it's not pastor. Pastor's mentioned twice. It's the least mentioned term for leadership in the New Testament church. And the next most mentioned, so you've got this word poimen, which is pastor. You've got another Greek word presbyteros, which is elder or someone who is mature. And then you have another Greek word which is used more than any other by like 5 times or more. And it's a compound word, episkopos. It's actually 2 words, epi, which we get epic from, which means big, and skopos, which is the Greek word for vision. So when you put those 2 words together, you've got big vision, or can I put it another way, the big picture. You want to develop self-awareness, keep the big picture. Don't get drawn down rabbit holes of emotional nothingness and emotional, I don't know about what it is, but sometimes some people seem to thrive on negative emotional crap. And social media fuels it. And people get pulled down rabbit holes of emotional turmoil. It's almost like they love feeding on the dead stuff. There's a jellyfish that lives in the depths, the deepest parts of the ocean, that if it needs to, it can survive by eating or devouring or consuming its own rotting flesh. Don't be like the jellyfish that lives on. Get a bit of perspective. Get a bit of episkopos. Exercise a bit of leadership. Now, we understand leadership is influence, and what I'm talking about is the most powerful kind of influence that you can exert as a leader, and that is self-influence. The Bible calls it self-control, self-influence, self-leadership, keeping the big perspective and being determined to stay above your own life. Where you keep perspective, you don't get dragged down into stuff where all of a sudden your emotions are dragging